Welcome to the Trellix Spotlight series. My name is Nick, and I will be your host. Today's session will focus on the resurgence of Emotet. This session will be recorded. If you prefer not to participate in the recorded session, please feel free to disconnect at this time. A link to today's recorded presentation will be emailed to all registered attendees. This webinar is a brief overview covering common use cases and scenarios regarding this topic. It is not intended to be all-encompassing. If assistance is needed, please contact Trellix technical support. If you have questions during the webinar, please type them in the Q&A window. This webinar may run longer or shorter based on your participation, and we recommend asking as many questions as you can to make the most of this series. If the Q&A window is not displayed, click the tab at the bottom of your session window and click on the Q&A icon. We will answer the questions during the final section of this webinar. If you experience any audio issues during the webcast, please drop and attempt to reconnect. Our speaker today is Sean Campbell. Sean is a Senior Advanced Malware Technical Support Engineer that joined McAfee in 1999. Sean helps deliver quality assistance with implementation of best practices for threat remediation and propagation prevention. Sean works directly with McAfee Labs and malware support to help facilitate, conduct root cause analysis, and determine a solution. He offers malware guidance and coaching to support teams around the world. Ladies and gentlemen, Sean.
Cool, thanks, Nick. I want to welcome everyone to another Trellix Spotlight series. On today's agenda, we're going to be looking at Emotet. Up first, we'll look at Emotet, and here what we're going to look at is kind of a high-level overview of what Emotet is. Once that concludes, we'll go into characteristics and symptoms. We're going to kind of look at the common payloads amongst the various Emotet samples in the wild. Once we conclude with characteristics symptoms, we'll go to the MITRE ATT&CK techniques, look at all the different MITRE ATT&CK techniques that we'll observe within the characteristics and symptoms, as well as some that we may not, that might be kind of underlying issues that we see. Once MITRE ATT&CK techniques wrap up, we'll go into prevention and recommendation. And here I'll actually give you the most common countermeasures you can provide to prevent Emotet from coming in your environment and spreading throughout. Once prevention and recommendation concludes, we'll go into additional end user recommendations. In this case, we're going to look at specific recommendations that are for new Emotet campaigns. Once that concludes, then we'll go into a QA. So without further ado, let's go ahead and look at what is Emotet. So Emotet is an advanced server-side downloader that primarily spreads through phishing or spam mail. Emotet is a sophisticated Trojan that primarily functions as a downloader or dropper to install additional malware or unwanted programs onto the victim's computer. Although Emotet can come in various file formats, current Emotet campaigns are leveraging malicious macros embedded in XLSs. Current Emotet builds are leveraging command batch scripts, PowerShell, WScript, and RunDLL to deliver second stage payloads. The command and control servers for Emotet campaigns are used to accomplish three objectives. Primarily, the command and control servers are used for downloading new Emotet binaries to continuously evolve and evade security solutions by updating its capabilities and binaries. Secondly, Emotet is used for downloading and installing bots such as TrickBot or QuackBot and info stealers such as Agent Tesla. The third objective for the command and control servers is phishing, which is used to entice users into providing PII via social engineering techniques. Emotet can be difficult to remediate due to its worm-like capabilities that enables network-wide outbreaks or infections. Up next, let's go and take a look at the characteristics and symptoms. In this case, we're going to look at three common payloads that I've seen through various samples that I've sandboxed. However, we're going to have 4 samples, but there are just going to be 3 common payloads. As for the first sample, upon executing the Excel spreadsheet, it invokes WScript to run a malicious obfuscated VBS file from the C program data directory. The VBS in turn executes a malicious BAT file from the same working directory, invoking PowerShell to run a base64 encoded command. Deobfuscating that PowerShell arguments reveals network calls to 12 command and control servers that are utilized for phishing, stolen data upload, and download of the Emotet DLL. The downloaded Emotet DLL is loaded by rundll32.exe and connects to its command and control server for the next stage payload, whether that be phishing, info stealing, new Emotet DLL downloads, and so on. So taking all that into consideration, let's go and look at the artifacts that we just looked at that were dropped during that payload there. So first up, what we're seeing is the VBS file that was dropped in the C program data directory. In this case, you can see upon the time that I actually sandboxed this and I analyzed the sample, we already had a Trojan classification in the cloud, and it was classified as RDN generic.x. In this case, what you see is very obfuscated code. However, you'll see wskip create objects commands, you'll see the batch file, and then you'll see run commands at the very end. Following that, we're going to look at the actual batch file itself. So once again, it was classified as Trojan in the cloud upon sandboxing, and it was classified as a bat/downloader.ay. As previously explained, this is nothing more than the base64 encoded command, which we know reached out to 12 command and control servers, which were utilized for phishing, info stealing, or Emotet DLL downloads. So now let's go ahead and take a look at the command and control servers. So in this case, what I'm doing is I'm utilizing trustedsource.org. Here you have the option to check a single URL, or you can check a URL file list. What I did is I went ahead and grabbed all 12 of the domains, the command and control servers for that particular Emotet build, and I piped them in as a URL or a list file. And it came back with 12 malicious high-risk or 12 high-risk ratings. One thing I will say that I've seen that I really do like about it, Emotet campaigns currently are just repurposing old command and control servers. I would say that 95% of all the samples I've looked at are connected to high risk and or medium risk site, just depending on the categorization. For instance, if it's just a phishing site, it might be classified as a PUP, medium risk. However, if it's utilized for downloading malware or for info stealing, then it could be rated high risk. The categorizations that we're seeing that are common amongst all the different Emotet samples are going to be malicious sites, PUPs, as well as malicious downloads. And you might have some that are classified as phishing as well. A lot of those kind of fall under PUP categorization as well. So moving right along, let's go ahead and look at our second symbol. In this case, upon executing the Excel spreadsheet, it invokes MSHTA to download and run a malicious JavaScript, which is within an HTML file. The downloaded file, oo.html, containing the malicious JavaScript is encoded with HTML Guardian to obfuscate the code. The malicious JavaScript invokes the PowerShell to download the Emotet payload from http://87.251.86.178/pp/ppg to the C user's public documents directory. The downloaded Emotet DLL is loaded by rundll32.exe and connects to its command and control server for a third stage download. So in this case, let's go ahead and look at the command and control servers. Here, once again, we're going to go to trustedsource.org, and we're going to do, once again, check URL list file. However, even though we shared just one unique IP address, there was two command and control servers in there. One was for the HTML download and one was for the PNG download. And in this case, once again, they're both rated high risk. Kind of what I explained earlier, that's one thing that is really a good fight mechanism against the new Emotet campaigns. They're just repurposing old command and control servers and nothing more. So moving right along, now what we're going to look at is the final payload that I'm seeing with new Emotet campaigns. So in this case, we're just going to look at two, but they're basically the same. So for our file samples, upon executing the Excel spreadsheet, it invokes rundll32 to load a form of a DLL from the logged in user directory that the malicious macro stores as an OCX file, in this case, ix.ocx. The malicious macro uses rundll32.exe to execute Emotet through the DLL register server DLL entry point. Emotet then copies the Emotet randomly named DLL file in the form of an interchangeable file formatted file that is stored in Windows syswal62 and Windows System32 directories. The downloaded Emotet DLL is loaded by rundll32 and connects to its command and control server for the next stage payload. These techniques are then duplicated utilizing services.exe in hopes to evade security one way or the other. So for the second sample, we see the same techniques where the malicious office macro uses rundll32.exe to execute the OCX through the DLL register server DLL entry point. Next, let's go out and look at a prevalence geographic distribution. So in this case, what we're looking at is the 4 Emotet samples that I looked at. So your third column to the right, you'll see total unique MD5s, which is 4. However, back to the far left, we see 365 total detections amongst those 4. However, if you look to the right of that, you'll see 9 unique organizations. So in this case, we're just looking at those 4 specific samples and where they're located at geographically. Here we'll see North America. We see East European, we see APAC regions. However, if I go and grab some more samples, so what I did in here is I just went and grabbed another random 20 samples. So now we have 24 samples. We see a total of 2,356 detections across 54 unique organizations. In this case, we're looking at North America as well as Central America. More European countries are hit, as well as South Africa, APAC, and in this case, what you're seeing is Japan as well. One thing I will note, as of current times, this was gathered about mid-February. All this data. Now that we're looking at, Japan seems to be the most targeted country right now globally. EMEA, APAC, we're getting a lot, of course, in North America, but now I'm seeing more Japan than anything else. One thing to note is, like, when I ran a report for Emotet samples, from November 18th, 2021 to February 11th, 2022, we saw over 136,000 Emotet samples, with over 103 of those coming since January 1. To put that in perspective, that's a breakdown of roughly 2,500 Emotet samples that we're seeing a day submitted into labs, as well as telemetry that we're gathering through the ATR team and other labs organizations. As of that day, on February 11th, there was 3,271 known command and control servers. So kind of put that in perspective, that there's a large number of command and control servers. However, they're just repurposing these. So, the thoughts are whoever's running these campaigns are the same people because of how they're actually just repurposing the command and control servers. All right, so let's go ahead and take a look at MITRE ATT&CK techniques that we've seen observed in the previous slides, as well as what I observed in my sandbox environment. So up first, what we have is remote system discovery, which is technique 1018. In this case, adversaries may attempt to get a listing of other system by IP address, host name, or other logical identifier on a network that may be used for lateral movements from the current system. Second technique is technique 1027, which is obfuscated files or information. In this case, adversaries may attempt to make an executable or a file difficult to discover or analyze by encrypting, encoding, or otherwise obfuscating its contents on the system or in transit. This is a common behavior that can be used across different platforms and the network to evade defenses. And specifically talking about Emotet, what we saw here was software packaging, which is technique 1027.002. Next technique we utilize is masquerading, technique 1036. Here, adversaries may attempt to manipulate features of their artifacts to make them appear legitimate or benign to users and/or security tools. Masquerading occurs when the name or location of an object, legitimate or malicious, is manipulated or abused for the sake of evading defense and observation. Next technique is going to be technique 1041, which is exfiltration over C2 channel. Here, adversaries may steal data by exfiltrating it over an existing command and control channel. Stolen data is encoded into the normal communication channel using the same protocol as command and control communications. Next up, process injection, which is technique 1055. In this case, adversaries may inject code into processes in order to evade process-based defenses, as well as possibly elevate privileges. Process injection is a method of executing arbitrary code in the address space of a separate live process. In this case, what we saw here is DLL library injections, which is technique 1055.001. Here, adversaries may inject DLLs into processes in order to evade process-based defense, as well as possibly elevate privileges. DLL injection is a method of executing arbitrary code in the address space of a separate live process. Next technique is 1057, which is process discovery. Here, adversaries may attempt to get information about running processes on a system. Information obtained could be used to gain an understanding of common software or applications running on systems within a network. Next one, we're going to have a couple that fall under. We have technique 1059, which is command and script interpreter. Here, adversaries may abuse command and script interpreters to execute commands, scripts, or binaries. In the case that we're looking at in Emotet, we saw PowerShell, which is technique 1059.001. We saw Windows Command Shell, which is technique 1059.003. And then there's also going to be Visual Basic, which we haven't looked at, but it is within the new campaigns. It's technique 1059.005. The next technique utilized by Emotet campaigns is 1071, which is application layer protocol. Here, adversaries may communicate using application layer protocols to avoid detection, network filtering by blending in with existing traffic, commands to the remote system, and often the result of those commands will be embedded within the protocol traffic between the client and the server. T1095, non-application layer protocol. Here, adversaries may use a non-application layer protocol for communication between host and C2 server or among infected hosts within a network. Next up on our techniques utilized is going to be ingress tool transfer, which is technique 1105. Here, adversaries may transfer tools or other files from an external system into a comprised environment. Second to last on here is going to be email collection, which is technique 1114, which is adversaries may target user email to collect sensitive information. Emails may contain sensitive data, including trade secrets or personal information. They can prove valuable to adversaries. Adversaries can collect or forward email from mail servers or clients. In the case of Emotet, specifically, it uses local email collection, which is technique 1114.001. And last, for this particular page, we're going to look at technique 1124, which is system time discovery. Here, an adversary may gather the system time and/or time zone from a local or remote system. The system time is set and stored by the Windows time service within a domain to maintain time synchronization between systems and services in an enterprise network. Now let's go ahead and look at our last MITRE techniques here. So up first, what we're going to see is deobfuscate decoded files or information, which is technique 1140. In this case, adversaries may use obfuscated files or information to hide artifacts of an intrusion from analysis. Next technique is going to be 1203, which is exploitation for client execution. Here, adversaries may exploit software vulnerabilities in client applications to execute code. Next up, we've seen a lot of this user execution, which is technique 1204. Here, an adversary may rely upon specific actions by a user in order to gain execution. Users may be subjected to social engineering to get them to execute malicious code by, for example, opening up a malicious XLS file or link. In the case of Emotet, it uses two different techniques under here. It uses technique 1204001, which is malicious link, and it uses technique 1204002, which is malicious file. The next one that we're going to look at is signed binary process execution, which is technique 1218. In this case, adversaries may bypass process and/or signature-based defense by proxying execution of malicious content with signed binaries. In the case of Emotet, we see a couple of different ones. We see technique 1218.005, which is MSHTA, as well as run DLL32, which is technique 1218.001. Moving right along, we're getting to technique 1497, which is virtualization sandbox evasion. Here, adversaries may employ various means to detect and avoid virtualization and analysis environments. Next technique is going to be 1543, which is create or modify system process. Here, adversaries may create or modify system-level processes to repeatedly execute malicious payload as part of persistent. The technique utilized here is Windows Service, which is technique 1543.003. Next up, we're going to see unsecured credentials, which has a few different ones, or has one that actually falls underneath here, but a couple of different credentials techniques in general. So as for T1552, adversaries may search compromised systems to find and obtain insecurely stored credentials. These credentials can be stored and or misplaced in many locations on a system, including plain text files, operating system or application specific repositories such as credentials and registry, or specialized files or artifacts, which are going to be private keys. In this case, we saw credentials in files, which is technique 1552001. The next technique we're going to look at is technique 1555, which is credentials from password stores. Here, adversaries may search for common password storage locations to obtain user credentials. In this case, we saw credentials from web browsers, which is technique 1555.003. And the last techniques we're going to look at are going to be phishing, which is 1566. Here, adversaries may send phishing messages to gain access to victim systems. All forms of phishing are electronically delivered social engineering. Phishing can be targeted, known as spear phishing. In spear phishing, a specific individual, company, or industry will be targeted by an adversary. The techniques that we see with the Emotet are going to be spear phishing attachment, which is technique 1566.001, and spear phishing link, which is technique 1566.002. All right, up next, let's go and look at prevention and recommendation. So in this case, out of all the samples I ran, what I looked at was the most common countermeasures across all different payloads that I'm seeing with the Emotet builds in the new current campaigns. But what I'm looking at here is I'm actually trying to kill at the very first stage. I'm not worried about the third or the fourth stage, because the more stages we miss, the more that our security becomes compromised. So what I did here is I'm getting a number of different countermeasures, but I'm trying to aim towards that very top level of detection. Up first, let's go ahead and look at ENS Adaptive Threat Protection Rules, which is also known as ATP/JTI. So in the case of the very first one that we see is Rule 4, which is use GTI file reputation to identify trusted or malicious files. This rule determines if a file is trusted or malicious based on the file's GTI reputation. This rule will help detect the second stage DLL download. So in this case, since only binaries, APKs, and PDFs are actually sent to the cloud for GTI file reputation, what we're seeing here is we're seeing detection on the actual Emotet DLL downloader. I will say that the vast majority of all samples I did sandbox, we already knew about the DLL, whether we had one in sample database or we actually had metadata, or it was just using common data strings amongst the other DLLs. So that is one good thing is, what I said earlier basically is that we know about these command and control servers are being repurposed. Another thing, these DLLs aren't changing much. So we do have a lot of cloud GTI reputations in place for them already. Up next, we have Rule 5, which is use GTI URL reputation to identify trusted or malicious processes. So related to MITRE technique 1204, which is user execution. This rule determines if a process is trusted or malicious based upon GTI URL reputation. Rule 238, identify abuse of common processes spawned from non-standard locations. This is related to MITRE technique 1036, which is masquerading. In this case, files may masquerade as legitimate files by hiding in non-standard locations. This rule provides protection from files being executed from suspicious locations, which are often used by attackers. This rule is set to observe mode by default. The next rule is 239, identify suspicious command parameter execution. This is related to MITRE technique 1059, which is command and scripting interpreter. This rule identifies the suspicious execution of applications through command line parameters. The next one is Rule 263, detect processes accessing suspicious URLs. This is related to MITRE technique 1204, which is user execution once again. Here, we detect processes accessing suspicious URLs, which are used to download malicious content. Next rule, 309, block processes attempting to launch from Office applications. Here, it's related to MITRE technique 1566, which is phishing. This one will prevent Office applications from launching suspect processes. With Office documents being a primary entry vector used to deploy malware, the rule prevents Office applications from being abused to deliver malicious payloads. The rule is enabled by default only on the security rule group assignment. Rule 312, prevent email applications such as Outlook from spawning script editors and dual-use tools. This is related to MITRE technique 1204 once again, which is user execution. Spam emails are common initial attack vectors being utilized by malware authors. This rule will help detect suspicious use of email applications by preventing the launching of uncommon processes. The next two kind of go hand in hand, which we have Rule 322, which is prevent MSHTA from being launched by any process for all group assignments. And Rule 323, which is prevent MSHTA from being launched as a child process. Both rules are related to MITRE technique 1218, which is signed binary proxy execution. Here, MSHTA-exe is a utility that executes Microsoft HTML applications. Attackers can use MSHTA to execute malicious HTA files, JavaScript, or VB script. This rule will help detect the malicious use case. So next up, let's go and actually look at an ENS exploit prevention rule. To kind of give you an idea of this rule, every sample I ran for several weeks and I continue to run them has violated this particular rule. So basically, this is created to prevent buffer overflows and illegal API use exploits and to protect files, registry keys, registry values, processes, and servers. This is an enhanced expert rule for exploit prevention rule ID 61027, which is MS Word trying to execute unwanted programs, with added protection for threats that execute other programs. If you implement this rule, you should disable exploit prevention signature 6107. This is, from what I saw, by far the best countermeasure I've seen with the new Emotet campaigns. One, they're all masquerading with XLSs. Even in the older ones, they were coming in with, WinWord. However, even the older builds, they would come in via executables and/or, they would actually download that second stage through phishing attacks or other attacks. In this case, more often than not, I'm seeing the XLS as the primary entry vector threat with these new Emotet builds. I've seen a couple executables or scripts that are embedded in archives that are password protected here and there, but by far XLS is by the most common one that I'm seeing. In this case, what we're seeing is a couple of different ones. So the 4 samples, for instance, that I actually we showed earlier, this will show you a block on every one of them. So I saw a block with wscript.exe. I saw a block with command.exe. And then I saw a block with rundll32.exe. So this is kind of tell you this rule, how robust it is and how in-depth it can do. So no matter what your payload is, out of the common payloads, this rule will actually block it and prevent it. This particular rule is published on a entry vector KB that we keep up to date and support. As malware actually evolves, we will update this article as well. Up next, what we're going to do is we're going to look at some access protection rules. So these are suggested ENS custom AP rules for downloaders. So in the first case, we have it titled Emotet Rule Number 1. Of course, you can title it anything you want to. One thing that you will notice throughout these slides, I only have my actions set to report. And the reason being is you want to thoroughly test everything in your environment prior to deployment, just so we don't do any type of business interruption. So even though these are very targeted rules, I always suggest just go ahead and put everything in report mode before you do it in block mode, just to make sure we're not seeing any falses and or adding any exclusions if need be. So in the case of Emotet Rule 1, what we're doing here is the name, I just called it XL. We're doing an inclusion status of include. File name or path is xl.exe. Now let's go and actually look at the sub rules here. So our first rule is command name is .cmd. So the sub rule type is files. The operations is execute. And here the target is inclusion of include, and the files is command.exe. So what we're doing here is we're preventing a process execution. So if xl.exe tries to execute command.exe, it will terminate that. I'm really big more on the process execution termination versus trying to target files. I do have some specific files in here for the Emotet campaign, but I would much rather implement, XL preventing the execution of command.exe because it kills it at a higher level versus trying to target a dropped or a downloaded file. The second sub rule that we have here is name, run DLL32. The sub rule type is files, and the operations is execute. In this case, we got target, inclusion is include, and we have file run DLL32.exe. Keep in mind, you can actually do all these in one particular one. I just kind of want to break it down to show you the different ones that I'm adding here. And the next one we're looking at, we're doing the exact same thing, but we're adding PowerShell. So name, PowerShell, subrole type is files, the operation is execute. We have a target of include, and then our file is PowerShell.exe. And last but not least on this particular one is question mark script. So we saw W script execution. I like to do question mark script because this will also take place of, C script, VB script, and all the other ones. So in particular, we saw W script, but you can see other ones. So in this case, we have a name of question mark script. Our subrole type is files. Our operations is execute. And we have an inclusion of include, and the files is question mark script.exe. So in this case, these are some of my favorite ones since we're targeting a process execution from one to the next one. There is that KB I talked about earlier for entry vector threat. This and some of the other ones are actually going to be in there as well. So these are really good rules to utilize if you want to prevent one process from executing the other one. So now next what we did is we're doing the subrole types of actual files versus processes in this case. So we're still keeping our main targeted executable as xl.exe. However, we're going to prevent a create of different file types. So what we saw in the characteristic symptoms earlier on, we're just going to look at those here. So in this case, the name is OCX. We have a subrole type files. We have operations create versus execute. And then our target is inclusion of include, and the files is question mark, :/users/ ***.ocx. So this will target any OCX in a user's directory, any subdirectory within a user's within the user's directory. The next one that we're going to look at is VBS file. So in this case, subrole type is files. We have our operations as create. And in this case, our target is going to be include for the inclusion, and our file is going to be question mark : /program data ***.vbs. And last but not least, and this was the very first example we looked at where it dropped a batch file and a VBS. So the same thing that we're going to do with the other two, we're going to name it BAT. Our subrole type is files. Our operation is create. We have an inclusion of include. And our file is going to be question mark : /program data ***.bat. And kind of like I explained before earlier, I do like the process execution, the prevention to prevent one process from executing the other one. But these are good ones if you want to target particular file types. These will be the last ones I would personally utilize. This is kind of just showing you the common denominators across all the different Emotet builds that I looked at. So up next, let's go ahead and actually create another rule. In this case, we just called it Emotet rule number 2. So once again, my action is report. However, once tested, you can go ahead and move it to block mode. In this case, we're going to do our target executables MSHTA. So the name is MSHTA, inclusion status of include, file name or path is going to be MSHTA. Now moving right along to our subrole, what we want to prevent here is MSHTA from executing PowerShell.exe. So in this case, the subrole name is PowerShell. The subrole type is files. The operations is execute. We have an inclusion of include, and our files is PowerShell.exe. Last up on the AP rules, we're going to go ahead and look at Emotet rule number 3. So the description, Emotet rule number 3, action report. Once tested, move to block mode. And the executable we're going to add in this case is PowerShell.exe. So name, PowerShell, inclusion status of include, file name or path is PowerShell.exe. And in this case, what we're going to do is we're going to prevent the execution of command.exe. So here, name of the subrole is CMD. The subrole type is files. The operations is execute. The target is inclusion include, and the file is command.exe. So here what we looked at is basically 3 different AP rules that are targeted specifically for Emotet and even other downloaders as a whole. We first utilized xl.exe to prevent execution of 4 different processes, as well as to prevent the creation of 3 different file types that are dropped. We then saw one where we prevented MSHTA from launching PowerShell. And then we looked at this one, we prevent PowerShell from actually launching command.exe. So these are pretty much the most common ones that are shared amongst all the different Emotet builds I saw. Up next, let's go and look at some ENS firewall roles. This is a role that I've always really liked just because there's a lot of processes that really should never leave your environment. So in the case of the ENS firewall rules, you can call it anything you want to. I just did downloader prevention because this is really good for all download or for most downloaders, shall I say. So in this case, I did an enable rule, specific actions block, which of course you're going to want to allow first, just to make sure you're not having any trusted processes that can't gain access externally, or whatever the case might be. There is the direction we're going to do out. On the networks, I just kept this default. So basically IP protocol, IPv4 protocol, as well as connection types, wired, wireless, and virtual. And then last but not least, we're going to go ahead and add our executables. So in this case, we did transport protocol, all protocols. The executables are PowerShell block, which is PowerShell.exe, scripting block, which is script.exe, WinWord, WinWord.exe, and then below that, you can't see that XL has also been added, but you cannot see it without scrolling down. You can see the scroll bar over the end. So although these are more targeted to XL, this is really good for a downloader one as a whole. Now, in the case of PowerShell and script, there's no real reason they should ever leave your environment. But when it comes to like WinWord and XL, there's other things that you have to implement. So if you're going to do this particular role and do WinWord and XL, you got to take consideration of Office 365 into place. So this one will also need to create appropriate allows based upon legitimate traffic generated by these. For instance, if the organization uses Office 365 and restricts computers on your network from connecting to the internet, Microsoft has created an article that lists the endpoints, basically your FQDNs, your ports, URLs, IPv4, and IPv6 address ranges. Here, you should include in your outbound allow list to ensure your computers can successfully use Office 365. So moving right along, let's go ahead and look at some dynamic application containment rules that I saw within my environment during sandboxing. So KB 87843, it's a list of and best practices of endpoint security dynamic application containment rule. In this case, we want to go ahead and just look at the more common ones. Although I saw a flood of different violations, I just looked at the ones that were more common across all samples I ran. Up first, allocating memory in another process, followed by creating a thread in another process, creating files with a bad extension, deleting files commonly targeted by ransomware class malware, executing any child process, find the services registry location, modifying user policies, reading from another process memory, in a process, terminate another process, write into another process memory that is, modifying portable executable files, modifying users' data folder, and last but not least, modifying files with a bad extension. So in this case, we saw, a number of different batch files dropped within the one payload. But deleting files commonly targeted by ransomware files is more of the cleanup routines that these perform, where they'll go and delete like the VBS or the BAT file. And in that case, if it's a delete, there's also rules for write and for create. But I went with the default. So basically what I saw is the cleanup routines that were performed on the VBS and the BAT files were actually triggering those. Of course, executing any child process is probably one of the more prevalent ones that I saw throughout all samples. It can get a little aggressive though. So when it does come to DAC, you'll see on the right-hand side, I've got everything set to report, not set to block mode, just to kind of get a better understanding of your environment. And once that we conclude that there's no falses and or add any falses to the exclusion list, then we can go ahead and actually start enabling those rules to block. Me personally, I like doing one or two at a time, and it's a lot best, in my personal opinion, to do it to maybe like a small group of like IT people, and then from there you can push it out to another department and just kind of get a feel. Since every environment runs different applications within business organizations, well, we might see a false in one, we might not see in the other one, and or vice versa. So it's best to do deployment to individuals at a time and then start adding exclusions. And then once we get all the exclusions put in place, then we can start doing blocks on those. But it's always best to gather telemetry via falses and do exclusions, and then move to block mode once we feel that we're comfortable and nothing's been blocked for a while. Last but not least, we're going to look at additional end user recommendations. So like I stated earlier, this is kind of specific to Emotet campaigns now, other than the very first one, which is security awareness and training. Here, we want to simulate a phishing and spam campaign to bring security awareness to those individuals who fall for social engineering attacks. Don't open file attachments or start suspicious links unless requested from the sender. View the email header or send a separate email to validate the sender before opening attachments. Be sure to remind your users to report suspect email to the organization's SOC. Remind your employees how and where to submit suspicious emails safely. Use mail and web gateway products to identify and block access to malicious links. Use anti-spam and anti-phishing filtering solutions to block email with suspicious links, attachments, and or untrusted senders. Prevent PowerShell from running on systems in which PowerShell isn't intended to run. Make sure that Microsoft Office security policies for macros are set to high or very high. And last but not least, block emails with password protected attachments. Once again, I appreciate you for joining today, and I'm going to go ahead and pass it back to Nick for a QA session.
Thanks, Sean. As a reminder, Trellix Education Services offers exceptional training to go along with our award-winning products. If you would like to learn more, please visit the website listed on the screen to see all of our offerings. Let's get our Q&A session started. I see we have several questions, but it's not too late to add your question. Please type it in the Q&A window to submit. Additionally, take a moment to fill out the survey. Your feedback and suggestions are always appreciated. Is there a quick way to report false positives, negatives to be published on GTI Reputation?
That's kind of a trick question per se. So are we looking at reporting through EPO? I guess is the question there. If we're looking to obtain information through EPO reporting on a GTI file reputation, we really don't know if it's a false or not just by reporting capabilities. You as the security admin, you would know if it's a trusted application, whether it be an in-house application or a third-party application. So you might be aware of the application and know it's an actual trusted application, but we wouldn't know it's a false because that's all just the classification in the cloud. What we want to do from there is, if it is a trusted application for your environment, we'd want to get a malware SR open up, and we can get that escalated to lab to get that false suppressed. However, for EPO reporting, it would be a little bit different. It's not going to tell you exactly what is a false and what isn't a false because we really don't know. It's just getting something from the cloud. The cloud's giving it a classification, whether it might be malicious, no malicious, or if you're using like just Artemis GTI where it's, very low, medium, whatever the threshold might be. We wouldn't know if it's a false just based upon that criteria. We'd want to get that analyzed by labs, let them deem that the file is innocent. There's no suspicious behaviors, no suspicious network calls or any of that. And then they can go ahead and analyze the file clean in the back end. And then at that point in time, it would suppress it throughout the GTI servers worldwide.
Got it. Okay, perfect. Thank you for that. Will adding these expert rules and custom AP rules affect the system performance?
It can, but it really takes a lot to actually start impeding performance via expert rules and AP rules. Of course, the more that you create, the more that the actual user mode processes have to achieve to determine if there's any violations, whether they be custom AP rules, whether they be expert rules. So the more that you create, it could start introducing performance hits, but it's going to be really minimal. It's nothing I ever see on my own. be honest, where I see more performance hits than anything would be like an exclusion list where, you're on maybe a storage server or, a server that just a lot of I/O throughput, and you're excluding all different types of file types, folders, you're doing low risk processes. Of course, the more that you're asking a product to do, the bigger the performance hit would actually be. So really, when it comes to some of these rules, if you're not creating an abnormal amount of them and doing a lot of exclusions and stuff like that, it should be a very low impact on the box itself. I would say that you're more often going to see an impact by exclusions and low risk processes because those lists can get kind of big, but just creating a couple rules here and there, it's very, very minimal when it comes to performance hit.
Got it. Okay, perfect. Thank you for that. Other than the countermeasures pointed out throughout the presentation, are there any others that could be recommended for Emotet and or other downloaders?
There actually are a couple. So kind of what I did there is I kind of did the most common, the most prevalent, and I'm going for, the first stages. Of course, we did look at some, VBSs, some OCXs, some BAT files, which are, like second stage of a malware attack in the case of Emotet. But there are other examples, and that would be really in that KB. So the entry vector KB, for instance, it has a number of different actual measures. Some that I can think of right off the top of my head is, for instance, there's an AP rule called creating new executable files in Windows folder. That one, in the previous campaigns with the Emotet, I literally called it the Emotet killer because it was pretty much like 99% of all Emotet builds that I looked at were copying their binaries to the Windows or the system directory. Therefore, that rule would prevent that. The first stage, the actual downloader itself, it wouldn't stop that, but it would actually prevent the second stage from being downloaded. It can be pretty aggressive. That's why I didn't include it. And as we saw with the demos, only one of those were actually writing the binary to the Windows directory. It was actually the syswow directory and the system32 directory, where all the other ones were writing in users directories and program data directories. So Emotet has kind of changed its techniques from earlier builds to newer builds, and they're writing anywhere around the local host on the C drive, mainly going to be in users or a program data directory, not really targeting the Windows folder. So the AT rule is really good for preventing some Emotets. The problem is it's so aggressive, I did leave that one out. And there are also going to be some exploit prevention rules. For instance, some PowerShell ones. We have, suspicious download string script execution is one that I can think of off the top of my head, as well as command restriction encoded command. We saw the base64 encoded PowerShell script that, once deobfuscated came down to 12 command and control servers. So some of these do actually hit. They can just be a little bit more aggressive. So what I try to do is I try to remove any of these more aggressive rules and not include it in here just because the false rate could be higher in your environment, where I went to, JTI, ATP rules that are very specific, or, the AP rules that are, one process executing another process, and or targeting, files dropped in specific directory locations. So there are more, and like I said, these are also in that KB that I was talking about as well. But there's also with like ATP, there is a ton of different ATP rules that focus in on specific MITRE attacks. For instance, I went with some of, like I said, some of the more prevalent ones. That some of the ones I can think of, you have obfuscated files or information, which would be MITRE technique T1027. And we have some rules in ATP like Rule 255, which is detect potentially obfuscated command line parameters. We have another one that's detect obfuscated command.exe command line parameters. And there's even other ones that are like for deobfuscated decoded files or information, which would be a MITRE technique 1140. We have Rule 264, which is inspect encoded command PowerShell. So there are going to be a lot of other ones, and of course, all rules are developed for specific malware campaigns or samples in mind. And where Emotet has so many different MITRE techniques, as well as other threats as well, there are going to be other triggers there. Just kind of give you like a high-level explanation of the ones that we did look at. So some of the MITRE techniques we looked at, masquerading. There's, like 3 or 4 different ATP JTI rules on that. Command and script interpreter, There's like 12 different rules, ATP rules on that. User execution, depending on the actual, what is executed, there's up to 14 rules on that. And then signed binary process execution, and then phishing. Of course, phishing is very common when it comes to entry vectors. So really what it comes down to is whatever the MITRE technique is, there's very possible an ATP JTI rule created for that, and or there could be exploit prevention rules, or there could be even AP rules that are not designed specifically for a MITRE attack technique. It may actually gear towards that particular technique and block that. So there are a ton of different rules that you can put in place. I just kind of went with more of a high level. Let's go for the first stage entry level blocks, as well as the more common payloads across all samples. Of course, some were like, Excel, executing PowerShell, and then we had other ones where they were just more one-offs based upon particular payloads that we see with samples. So there are a ton of other different ones, and that's where we're really coming down into the related content. We see all the KBs there. There's some for like DAC that we talked about. There's some for the entry vectors that I was talking about, as well as like JTI ATP roles, and there's a ton of good data inside those.
Got it. Okay, cool. Thank you for that. I think you may have answered this one just now, but are these countermeasures beneficial for malware campaigns other than the new Emotet campaign?
Oh, yeah. And I just kind of briefly touched on that one on the previous question. So the KB, the countermeasures for entry vector, which is KB 91836, it's pretty much an all-encompass KB for entry vectors as a whole. So whether it be email, whether it be web, or whether it be, direct access or anything like that. And that particular KB adds anywhere from ATP, JTI roles that we've seen in this presentation, as well as other presentations, or not even any presentations I've done in the past. But we also have DAC rules in there. We have the expert rule that I mentioned in there. And we have, anywhere from the firewall, messaging stuff, the custom AP rules, and, quick blurb on AMZ. So pretty much any component within ENS that can deter, that can block entry vector threats, that's in that particular KB, as well as some of the more common ones. I will say the ATP JTI section of that one, I do need to update because there's been a lot of new rules that have been out since that, as well as some that have been modified that need to be updated, or some that just been deprecated that are no longer there. So, or it went into another ID versus the old ID, which they do a lot of that merging and stuff. So there are some that I need to update on that under the ATP JTI section. And if you actually go and register yourself, I believe, I can't remember the exact terminology, but you can actually create a way, anytime that KB is updated, you get alerted on it. I don't know the exact verbiage, but it is on there where you can actually link yourself to it basically. And whenever I do update it, you'll get an email. And I do plan on updating that in the next week or so with these newer ATP JTI roles. And I need to go through some of the exploit prevention ones as well. Those are the two modules that are really updated, more along the lines like a monthly basis versus some of the AAC rules that really come out with like new builds or new content pushes, just depending on what the actual countermeasure is. And so I do need to update those, but yeah, that countermeasure for entry vector threats is really a good starting place for kind of securing your environment from entry vectors. However, I will say that's years worth of data, so what's in that could take, a very long time for anybody to implement, and it's kind of good to do one or two at a time. Focus on like ATP JTI, maybe expert rules, DAC, focus on a component and start adding some stuff, and then, deploy it, put it in report mode, and start creating exclusions based upon valid trusted applications in your environment that are trigger nodes, depending on what the component is and how to include an exclusion, because there are some like ATP JTI rules that are behavior-based. You can't exclude those because it's looking for a behavior, not a particular file. If it's file-based, we can always do a whitelist on that file in the cloud, and it would trust that file, therefore it wouldn't trigger that.
Got it. Okay, cool. Thank you for that. You mentioned the usage of expert rules. Are there any other expert rules that you can suggest?
Yeah, there actually are. So although we don't create the expert rules and support, labs can create them, as well as our ATR team can create them. So labs, they would create more expert rules that are geared towards exploits. So like if new exploit code comes out, a new vulnerability, a new CVE, if it's not covered under current content, it's very likely we could create an expert rule to block whatever that payload is for that vulnerability. So those come out from labs that are, like I said, more geared towards exploits. However, ATR does have a GitHub site, and you can literally Google McAfee ATR GitHub exploit prevention or expert rules, and you can pull it up. Inside there, there's a huge number of different rules. So like, for instance, I'm checking it out here, anywhere from like access protection to defense evasion, malware behavior, payload execution, privilege escalation, or even generic rules. So in this case, they can range from anywhere from exploit codes, so CVEs, to MITRE attacks, to unauthorized process usage, to even suspicious file create or execute, and so on. And then you have your generic rules for anybody that's kind of looking to learn how to write expert rules. There are some generic rules there, and they provide good examples of like creating rules based on actions performed on files, folders, registry values, and more. So if you're looking for an expert rule on maybe how can you prevent a certain file from being written to disk, there's an example of that. Or how to create a registry key, there's an example for that. So there are some of the more common, the high level, the easier ones out there that fall under that generic rules category within the ATR expert rules. So yeah, definitely go out there. Their ATR creates them based on campaigns and what they're seeing in in their research, whether it be dark web research, campaign research, whatever the case is, and they create those rules. The more that we actually download those rules and utilize them, the more that we'll start actually creating those. So anybody that's looking for expert rules and kind of an understanding on how they work and or some default ones, some generic ones that you can utilize, yeah, the ATR GitHub site would be perfect for that.
Got it. Okay, perfect. Thank you for that. Do the ENS exploit prevention content updates continuously update any of the rules that you've reviewed here?
Say that one more time. I think I misheard.
Oh, yeah, sure. Yeah. Do the ENS exploit prevention content updates continuously update any of the rules that you've reviewed here?
Now, they do go back and modify rules every so often, but it really depends on the rule. More often than not, I see the JTI ATP rules that are actually being updated, and that's really for behaviors for new campaigns or new threats, whether it be a MITRE attack or whatever the case might be. So they do actually update the ENS AP content updates. It's just, I get them whenever they come out, then I put them in my lab, and then if I get triggers on them to really call them out, add them to the KB. Now, whether they're modifying it or whatnot, that's really an engineering decision. So they can modify them, they can deprecate them, they can't actually create new ones just based upon the CVE and the vulnerability itself.
Got it. Okay, cool. Thank you for that.
I don't know if I answered that correctly or not. So if I left something out, then just go ahead and chime back in, and maybe I can answer that better. And actually,
okay.
There's another one here.
Yeah, I was about to ask that one. How does changing the reputation of an application in a TIE server different than submitting a sample to McAfee Labs and seeking a change in reputation? What is the best way to allow a known internal application detected by TIE reputation? Is it changing it on TIE directly, or should we submit it to McAfee Labs?
You know what? It can be both. So it really depends on how your environment's set up. So if you're using the local nodes to just go to the TIE server and bypass the GTI connectivity servers altogether, then really you can just do it in your end. So you could actually go and create a whitelist for that particular hash within the TIE server. And then, that would go out to your environment. So anybody that checked into the TIE server, it would have a classification whitelisting. However, that doesn't change it on our end. So if you're really looking for that sample to be whitelisted long-term, we want to get that escalated in the lab. So If that case, what you would do is you would just open up a malware SR, and to make it easy, provide application details, because that's something that labs is always going to ask. So it's a trusted app, and it has a classification of might be malicious. Then just provide the data, and we can escalate that in the labs and request whitelisting. However, if it does have GTI classification, we'd want to do an RMS false escalation on that, so they would suppress the RMS false in the GTI server farm, as well as actually whitelist it to prevent any future GTI or DAT detections.
Got it. Okay, perfect. Thank you for that. All right, looks like we got to all the questions, and we're out of time, unfortunately, for today's session. I want to thank everyone for joining today's webinar, and a big thank you to our speaker, Sean. As a reminder, a link to today's recorded presentation will be emailed to all participants. If you have any questions, comments, or suggestions about future session topics, please email me at nick.barnes@trellix.com. This concludes today's webinar. Stay safe, everyone.